Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War. This is the repeat of an episode published in September 2022, but I think it's an episode worth hearing again, bearing in mind that last month was 55 years since the Apollo 13 mission.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list to keep up with the latest episode. The words you heard at the start are the actual dramatic report from Apollo 13 to Mission Control alerting them to the life-threatening explosion that occurred on April the 13th, 1970. I'm speaking with Fred Haise, who was one of the 3 astronauts on the ill-fated moon mission when a design fault caused an oxygen tank to explode mid-mission, putting the Apollo 13 crew in mortal danger. This was the 7th crewed mission in the Apollo space program and the 3rd that was meant to land on the moon. Now, as you can imagine, I'm genuinely excited to be speaking with one of the Apollo astronauts. Fred and I talk about his life and his almost accidental entry into flying. We cover his admission into the astronaut program, the family impact, and as you can imagine, we go into some detail about his experiences on the Apollo 13 mission. Many of you will know of this mission via the film Apollo 13 starring Tom Hanks, and Fred shares his views on the film and corrects some of the inaccuracies. Now, Cold War history is disappearing, but a simple monthly donation will help keep this podcast on the air. You'll be part of our community, you'll get a sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster as a thank you, and you'll bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping to preserve Cold War history.
Hello there, my name's Andrew and I live in North London. I make a small contribution every month to Cold War Conversations because the stories are so good, they make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And that's good enough for me.
If a monthly contribution is not your cup of tea, we also welcome one-off donations via coldwarconversations.com/donate. I'm immensely delighted to welcome Fred Haise Jr. to our Cold War conversation. Your career is a long one, but I was surprised to discover that your earliest job was being a journalist.
I got interested in that direction from being the sports editor on the high school Biloxi High Tide newspaper. And during summers, even in high school, I did the lesser stories, some smaller stories like Pee Wee football games or junior high games for the local Gulf Coast, Biloxi, Mississippi Gulf Coast newspaper during that same time frame. The bigger reporter, full-time reporter, covered mainly the high school games, so I got the smaller features to cover during that period, and had planned to go on and did go on to college. In the first 2 years, was essentially majoring in that direction to be a major in journalism.
So, how on earth did you end up at NASA?
Well, yeah, what happened was the Korean War was going on. And when I finished approaching the second year, end of second year of college, I thought I would serve my country. And my father had always recommended I get into a program that would lead to a officer's commission. And it turned out with 2 years of college at the age I was, the only program that fit was the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. And I'd never been in an airplane in my life. So anyway, I joined sometimes at 18 years old. You don't think too far ahead. But I love flying. And that I instantly had a 90-degree turn in my thoughts about career path, that somehow it was going to be in aviation. Because you have to realize I'm talking about 1952. There was no space program yet. So, but aviation was what I thought I was going to spend my life at.
How many different aircraft types did you end up flying?
I think it was, if you count the A, B, C, D model kind of things of airplanes, 81, 81 types, and all classifications, transports, bombers, fighters, helicopters, gliders. Yeah, fairly wide variety of types of aircraft as well.
While we were off air, you mentioned that you started training around nuclear weapon release.
That was after I was had gone through 4 years in the military, and had actually started to work as a NASA research pilot. And my first NASA center I worked at was Cleveland, Ohio, Lewis Research Center, which is now named Glenn after John Glenn. And I was recalled into a reserve unit, Ohio Air National Guard unit, the 164th TAC Fighter Squadron. In fact, the whole wing was called up, the 3 squadrons called up, as well as a number of other guard units around the country during that particular period with the concern where Russia had parked missiles in Cuba and was looked at clearly as a threat that the U.S. wanted to go against. And so there was a major recall of forces, and everything's put on alert. Kind of a hazardous time for something really bad to happen.
Indeed. So how did you end up being selected for the astronaut program?
I had 3.5 years at that center. I mentioned Lewis Research Center. Then I moved on to their primary aircraft flight test center at Edwards Air Force Base in California, which was known then as Flight Research Center. It's now named Armstrong, after Neil Armstrong Flight Research Center. And I was engaged 3.5 years there in testing aircraft. And would have stayed because I really enjoyed. That was probably the most enjoyable flying time of my life. Was that episode at Flight Research Center. I was flying a lot of different aircraft, involved in 2 or 3 research programs, either as a primary pilot or support pilot, or one of what we used was evaluation pilots, and a lot of support missions for the X-15 rocket ship program that was going on at the time. And I had to think real hard, but I looked at where I was in the hierarchy of seniority within the pilot's office, and I knew I would likely never get to fly the X-15 before it was finished. So I might get to fly some of the lifting bodies. These were vehicles without wings that we were fixing to get into testing. But the thought of going to the moon was just something that I said, this will really be a great adventure that I shouldn't pass up, even though I had no idea what my odds were that I would get to be selected for one of the missions. So that's why I applied to be an astronaut.
Do you remember seeing or hearing Kennedy's speech about going for the moon?
Yes, I do. It was, of course, at Rice University. And I obviously was not in the arena. The people that had, at the time, sort of dreamt up, I'll call it the simplistic plan for going to the moon. But I knew there was, they'd been very busy with Mercury and Gemini programs. So I figured they didn't have much depth in their work at that point. Now they were given this grand mission, which, of course, no one could turn away from. And so it seemed, at least in terms of thinking timing, to be a pretty tall mountain to climb. And as it was, the technology barely supported the attempt to do that, certainly as far as computing power, both on the ground and what we had on board, which was like 1/10 of a kilobyte. So that's what we had on board, not megabyte, 1/10 of a kilobyte.
Incredible.
So we didn't have a very big machine, hand wired. And I'm sorry, it was 1/10 of a megabyte. Sorry.
That's still incredible.
1/10 of a megabyte. And so I knew it was going to be a tough hurdle, as it turned out to be.
Did you ever meet Werner von Braun, the German scientist who was working for NASA?
I only met him at, I call it, a couple of meetings and a couple of social events. In my assignment as a support crew, I was given the appointment that kept me busy with the testing and development of the Lunar module, the landing craft. The astronauts, probably Charlie Duke and Stu Roosa and Frank Borman, I think were primarily concerned with the Saturn rocket. And so they likely spent a lot more time in technical meetings with Werner during that time. And so I really didn't get to know the gentleman very well at all.
With history, we're aware of his Nazi past. Was that ever talked about at NASA or not?
No, it never occurred to me anyway. Yeah, he was, as far as I was concerned, he was one of the team, and furnishing the big rockets that were going to get us airborne. No, a Nazi thing. I never came up, at least at the centers that I know. It might have been something in the Washington scene, but the politics side of it. But no, not in the program itself.
I was surprised to discover that at one point you were part of the Apollo 11 crew.
Yes, I was the backup crew on both Apollo 8 and 11. In fact, the backup crew on 8 was Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and myself. We were the backup on 8. And fortunately, I didn't get to cycle to 11 because Mike Collins, who had a medical problem, and had seniority over me in the lineup, got well, and so he moved back into his position on Apollo 11. And I served another backup assignment with Jim Lovell and Ken Mattingly.
Can you remember how they delivered that news to you, that you weren't going to be part of 11?
Bill Anders told me. At the time, Bill Anders was actually going to be in the backup crew, not Ken Mattingly. And Bill, within a few months, decided he would leave the program. And that's when Ken Mattingly moved into that position. No, Bill Anders informed me that the backup crew would be Jim and myself and himself.
I mean, you must have been disappointed because at that point, was it obvious that 11 was going to be the first attempt?
No, I was obviously disappointed, but at the same time, I had to recognize the facet of Mike's having been, actually, he was in the position to fly 8. He was the prime crew and had the medical issue and got pulled off of that mission. So I recognized that he had the seniority and the right to move back in if he got well to a prime spot. So no, you always wish you flew every mission. I mean, so that wasn't any different than being the backup on 8 or the backup on 16. I did. So I always wanted to go fly.
Yeah. You must remember watching the moon landing. Where were you when you saw the landing?
There's pictures floating around about that. Charlie Duke was the Capcom and mission control. And right to his left was Jim Lovell. And right on the other side of Jim, I was. But that was pretty traditional. The backup crew at critical phases of the mission would normally be in mission control. Just, they were trained to go fly the mission and knew what was going on, well, the procedures, the handbooks that were being used. And so it was kind of customary for the backup crew to be available to help in any discussions that went on if a problem arose as to, what steps and actions may be taken. As it turned out, in spite of those alarms that were triggered, we had nothing to say about those. It was primarily Draper Labs and the Guido people in mission control that worked those warnings that came on that last part of the landing that had to be given, they had been given a go to proceed.
That last part of the landing, the atmosphere there must have been quite tense because there was that danger of them running out of fuel because they had to go and land in a slightly different area than where they'd originally planned.
Right. Yeah. No, that was the critical part. The alarms, I was praying they wouldn't, and in spite of anything, wouldn't have called an abort, because Neil had not reported any control problems. So, as far as I was concerned, the LEM was flying fine. It just had some lights coming on. So I was hoping they would not call an abort, and Neil would just go ahead and land anyway.
I mean, what was the atmosphere like when the Eagle had landed?
Well, it was, you call it a sort of celebration in the room, because we had made the goal that had been set out by the president. But no, I mean, there wasn't any champagne or anything like that. Those kind of parties were in the next few days after they got back and safely entered. Then there was some more festivities of what you call traditional celebration.
Nixon had prepared a speech in case they hadn't returned. And there's obviously that moment of worry that, they have to fire that one engine to get back off the moon. That's
true of every mission.
Yeah.
Every mission that one engine had to fire.
Yeah.
So Apollo 8 and every one there was, that engine had to fire to get you out of lunar orbit.
Yeah. We'll obviously get onto Apollo 13 in a moment, but at least you had a few more options there, I guess.
Well, we had a full LEM on Apollo 13, but if you landed, you, of course, had used up the LEM, basically. And so you were wholly dependent on that one SPS engine to fire in that fairly lengthy burn to get you out of lunar orbit and roughly in the direction to get back to an entry.
How did you feel when you discovered that you were going to be prime crew for 13?
Well, I knew that with the completion of 11. The normal rotation was 3 crews. So there wasn't any question I'd be on 13. Well, I'm sorry. I would be on 14. That's what I was thinking. I'd be on 14 because there was a 3-crew rotation. I guess the surprise was that we ended up on 13 because Jim Lovell got a call when headquarters, I think, had overridden Deke's selection with Al Shepard and Stu Russa and Ed Mitchell to fly 13. And the headquarters got into it, realizing that Al Shepard had not flown in some time on any mission, and Stu Russa had never trained for a mission. So they elected to give them more training time, and that's why that, and it's the only time that was done. But Deke called in my commander, Jim Lovell, and suggested or requested actually would he be willing to fly 13? And of course Jim, without any hesitation, said, "Yeah, we'll fly. The sooner you fly, the better." And we had, of course, trained through 2 previous missions, so it wasn't going to be as difficult, certainly for us, to get ready.
How did your wife feel about you going into space and flying that mission?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think all the wives had reserves, but not just because it was an astronaut or it was a lunar mission. At least those of us that were test pilots. If I recall, the year I left Edwards that year, they had 9 test pilots die at Edwards Air Force Base in various ways. So the business I had been in for 7.5 years before as a research pilot or a test pilot was fraught with the same concerns. So it wasn't anything new. I mean, it doesn't matter if you fall from 500,000 miles or fall from 100 feet. The result's the same. So, there's nothing magical about it happening at the moon versus an aircraft over Edwards Air Force Base. You get a lot more press, a lot more publicity, but that's about the only difference.
Let's have a look at Apollo 13, and you're sitting basically on top of this huge firework. I mean, do you think about what could go wrong, or do you just think it's going to be a good mission?
Well, you obviously think about things going wrong. That's spent most of your training is spent training to handle things that go wrong. Thousands of hours in a simulator we had. The command module simulator, they could impart over 500 failures in systems, what we consider credible failures. And the LEM less, I think the lunar module probably had about 300. And they were deliberate exercises we did with a group called SimSoup, where we integrated with mission control. We would be in the simulators that emulated the spacecraft, linked to mission control, so all the data was on their scopes, just as if we were in flight. And this team of specialists, a dozen people, for each of the simulations we ran, dreamt up failures to try to make us look bad, either us and our mission control in combination. So we went through thousands of hours of nothing. In fact, they only gave us a few runs without any problems, and couple of weeks approaching the flight. So we could kind of feel what the real timeline would be like with nothing going wrong. So yeah, we obviously, you think a lot about that. Not just then, though, we were involved in the development and design. So you work a lot with reliability engineering through the whole design phase, supporting what's called FEMAS, failure mean effects analysis, that looks at every possible failure, a wire open, a wire short, a valve fail closed, open. So that's part of the design protocol to build the machine. And of course that drives, if you don't like manifestations of failure, to maybe add in redundancy or add in more telemetry of some sort. So you're involved all the way through that, through the whole getting the vehicle ready to be flown. Yeah, it's not. They don't. You don't just sit around and one day they say we're ready to fly. You've probably been at it with the involvement. I spent over a year at Grumman during that time testing lunar modules, and of course in that testing I learned a lot more than I needed to know to fly it. I literally knew in some cases what pin and what 48 pin connector did what function, which you'd never need to know to fly. So we were very immersed in the guts of the machinery we were going to fly.
How long are you sitting there waiting for the Saturn V to take off? Once you're buckled in, how long are you sitting there waiting for liftoff?
I couldn't tell you exactly. It was several hours.
Several hours. Wow.
We went out late. I served a role on 8 and 11. On 8 and 11, I was the last one out of the cockpit, out of the capsule when the crew was strapped in. I did what was called a part of the closeout crew, and I had gone in and did all the switch setup to get the capsule in the readiness condition for them to board. And I did that for those two flights. So I was out there the night before, about midnight, to do all of that preparation for the crew to arrive. But you laid there after you were inserted, like on 13, for a couple hours. Really, the position I was in, the lunar module pilot, in the right couch, I had virtually nothing to do. The calls from the launch director and what switches or things had to be changed were mostly done by Jim Lovell or Jack Schweigert in the center couch. So and unfortunately, I couldn't enjoy the view because the escape tower was covering the windows. So I just had to lay there and listen to what was going on. You could feel some motion. They did a test to gimbal the engines, that kind of thing. So you could feel a little, not so much noise, but motion in the vehicle from things going on that way.
Can you describe what it feels like, the launch? How much is it moving around? You know, the vibration, is it a phenomenal level of vibration and noise that you've got going?
The Saturn V, of course, was an all-liquid system. It had 5 engines that ignited, produced, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The rocket weighed a lot. It was over 6 million pounds. So you did move away what I'd call with a lot of acceleration when the hold-down arms released the rocket. I've always told people I've been in fighter airplanes with an afterburner, and when you kick in the afterburner to start down the runway, you get a bigger kick in the pants than we did coming off the pad. I've heard of Suyov people flown Suyov. They have to really look at the clock starting to realize they lifted off. It's so gentle. And there is a little more thrashing around, though, because the big engines, the four outer ones, gimbal. They can swivel left and right and fore and aft to steer the rocket. And with that much thrust, 1.5 pounds each engine had, moving a very slight bit would give you a lot of lurching motion. Amplified probably because we were in a capsule way up on the top of the stack. So it's probably exaggerated in that respect. The most unusual motion was the left to right motion. I felt obviously in an airplane with turbulence of all kinds, low altitude at high speed on a hot day, lots and lots of turbulence, and being bounced around in the cockpit. But the sideways motion was more than I'd ever felt in an airplane. That seemed unusual. The G levels, though, overall, even the max G you got was modest. I'll say modest compared to fighter airplanes. It got to 4.5 Gs with the max on first stage at burnout. And fighters, even old vintage fighters I flew, you could pull over 7 Gs in air combat maneuvering. And modern fighters are pulling up to 9 Gs now. So the launch that way, and I'm talking about all of us had been military, all of us had been either fighter pilots and or test pilots. So, we'd all felt those sorts of things. I assume it's a much more profound ride for someone who's only flown an airliner that flies as a mission specialist, say, on shuttle. Be a lot more profound for them than it was for us on the Saturn.
So when did it sort of smooth? Was it once it had taken off?
After the end of the first stage, when the first stage shut down, and that was pretty abrupt. If you hadn't been strapped in tight, it'd probably thrown you into the instrument panel. That was a very sudden, went from 4.5 Gs to nothing. Once the second stage started up, all liquid system, 5 engines, 200,000 pounds each. It was a pretty smooth ride. Now, we had a happening in our second stage where the center engine suffering POGO, fluid instability in the feed system, was automatically shut down 2 minutes early. Fortunately, things would have started coming apart if it hadn't. And so we had that little burble of vibration for a short time, a few seconds during that period with the POGO effect. But other than that, it was a pretty smooth ride on the second stage from all other respects, and same on the third stage, which had only a single one of those J2 engines, a 200,000 pound single engine that took us out of Earth orbit to head to the moon.
How different was the first moments in space versus the simulations you'd done on the zero gravity flights?
There's no comparison. Obviously, the airplane at 0G gave us 25 seconds of free floating, whereas once you're in space, you're completely free to float around and float objects and that kind of thing. It's kind of euphoric. I found it, although I didn't follow instructions people gave me, and I moved around too fast too soon to get ahead of my timeline on tasks I had to do. Had more time to look out the window, and I ended up getting a slight case of space sickness, a little spit up, not a huge throw up, but a little spit up. And the nice thing about space sickness is if you quit moving a little bit, it goes away. And thereafter, I moved very slowly, particularly when I was rotating, and I never had it reoccur. So anyway, that was the only bad side effect I had of zero gravity, but it was euphoric to be able to float around. Made the cabins seem a little bigger because you could use the whole volume of those small vehicles. Of course, the biggest thing, so I won't say shocking, but stuck in my mind was when the first time we turned around and got a look at the Earth to see it visibly shrinking, because we're still moving away pretty fast after we left Earth orbit. And you could visibly see the Earth, now a ball, growing smaller. And that was the other difference in space flight for me from all my airplane flying. Even though I'd done Zoom flights in a 104 up to just under 90,000 feet, but it's nothing like being out at 20,000 miles, looking back at the Earth. So that was the other most unusual thing about being in space, that and zero gravity.
And did you take any personal items with you, or were you allowed to take any personal items with you?
Yes, yeah, we were each allowed a limited number and limited weight and limited volume of items to put into what was called a PPK, personal preference kit. And that was kind of a sad thing of our crew changeout late, where Jack Swigert replaced Ken Mattingly 2.5 days before launch. I'd probably spent phone calls, calling people, friends and family, asking them that I could fly something, what would they like me to fly for them? And I told them it had to be small and lightweight. So it took a little effort that way to figure out what I wanted to have in the PPK. And of course, poor Jack getting selected now to fly in Ken's replacement didn't have time to do that. So he didn't get really to carry what he'd consider his PPK. But it was small things, a ring. I carried a ring for a friend that was a Mason. I carried the crucifix off of rosary beads. An aunt wanted me to carry rosary beads, but that was too much, too big. So I took the crucifix off and flew it. Those sorts of things. I flew some of my Marine insignia, my initial second lieutenant bars, that kind of stuff. So, but it was literally small stuff in a very small volume packet that was vacuum sealed.
We probably can't talk without talking about the movie. And I mean, it features on there that you're playing music on a cassette player. Did that happen or not?
Yeah,
Did you take music with you?
We had a cassette player. I had nothing to do with the music that was chosen. I frankly can't tell you if the song they chose to play in the movie was the song we had on it or not. I think Jim mostly, with practically some people had just recommended things that might be on it. You're busy training, you don't spend a lot of time with that ancillary stuff. Yeah, so he probably did most of the picking of what was on the cassette. But it was a standard Sony, same kind you go buy in the store, that had been pre-recorded on the cassette that was in it. We played it some more for, I want to call it a little entertainment for a while, but then after we got busy and it got so cold, I don't remember playing it much later on in the mission.
You're slightly focused on other things, I guess, which sort of brings us neatly to where were you when the oxygen tank exploded?
Okay. I was in the lunar module putting away equipment that we had taken out of storage to use in a show and tell TV show, live TV show that we just finished. In fact, if the explosion had happened, say, 15, 20 minutes earlier, it would have happened during the live TV show.
Wow.
Because we just signed off literally. Of course, networks weren't carrying it. Mission Control was enjoying it. And I was still putting away equipment. Like I said, we did the show and tell. We picked things that we knew had not been ever talked about before, and some new things we were flying that had not been flown previous flights, that kind of thing. Jim was starting up to return to the command module through the tunnel was when this happened. So he was sort of drifting his way back upstairs to where Jack was all alone. And Jack made the first call. Houston, we've had a problem here. When Jim arrived in the capsule and got his headset on and did not return the call, he repeated it. So Houston got 2 calls. And what I think had happened was the panel, when it blew off, had hit the high gain antenna. That was our primary communication route to Mission Control at the time for the TV show to have high gain. And it knocked it off. It's a little bit out of alignment. And so briefly, there was no communication, I guess. That's why Mission Control hadn't answered Jack. But we'd gotten it back with the Omni antennas when Jim made his call, the small little horn antennas. I drifted up through the tunnel then to head back up to join the action, if you will, that was going on in the command module.
Here's the first 3 minutes of the crew initially reporting the explosion and what their instrumentation is showing. You'll hear the voices of Apollo 13's mission commander Jim Lovell, Jack Swaggart, the command module pilot, and Fred's voice too.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B plus undervolt. Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it. Okay, right now, Houston, the voltage is looking good. And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there. And as I recall, main B was the one that had a amp spike on it once before. Roger, Fred. In the interim here, we're starting to go ahead and button up the tunnel again. Roger. Yeah, that jolt must have rocked the sensor on, see now in O2 quantity 2, it's was oscillating down around 20 to 60%. Now it's full scale high again. Roger. And Houston, we had a restart on our computer. We had a pink light and the restart reset. Roger, restart and a ping light. Restart and a ping reset. And looking at our service module RCS UM1, we have B as Barbara Pole and D as Barbara Pole, helium 2, B as Barbara Pole, and secondary propellants I have A and C Barbara Pole. Tmax temperatures. Okay, AC2 is showing zip. I'm trying to reconfigure on that, Jack. Roger. Yeah, we got the main plus A undervolt now too, Sean. Main A undervolt. It's reading about 25 and a half. Main B's reading zip right now. Stand by one, Jim. 13 Houston, we'd like you to attempt to reconnect fuel cell 1 to main A and fuel cell 3 to main B. Verify that quad delta is open. Okay, Houston, I'm showing, I tried to reset and fuel cell 1 and 3 are both showing gray flags, but they're both showing zip on the flows. We copy. 13 Houston, we'd like you to open circuit fuel cell 1. Leave 2 and 3 as is. Okay, I'll get to work on that. And I wish maybe looking out the hatch that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space. Roger, we copy your venting. It's a gas of some sort.
How soon did you realise the significance of what had happened?
Not what you'd call the true overall significance, but what was very quickly I figured out from looking at the panel from several readings and different instruments that we had lost oxygen tank 2. And for me, that was just all at once a sick feeling in my stomach because I knew that meant an abort. Right then, within a minute, I knew we had lost the landing. In fact, I knew we wasn't even going to go in the lunar orbit because the normal answer for that particular failure, that type of failure in a major system, where you only have one thing left, tank 1 in that case, you're going to turn home as soon as possible. Wasn't clear on how you're going to turn home, but that basically was what was going to happen. So I knew we'd lost a mission, at least a mission we had planned. So then we got into troubleshooting for almost an hour with the mission control as a not too long a time, but it became evident. I think mission control realized it sooner than we had. They had better granularity on their readings. that tank one was leaking, a very slow leak. And I guess that was what Jim reported sighting and seeing out the window at one point, that something was streaming away. That was the leaking of material out of oxygen tank one. And so the troubleshooting went on, as I said, for almost an hour. When basically they'd run out of ideas, we kept cycling valves and shutting off portions, even including fuel cells, reactant valves, or whatever, thinking a leak may be through a fuel cell. But they finally figured out, checking all the avenues they could think of, that they could not stop the leak. And so that's when Jim and I were asked to go to the lunar module and get it cranked up. I'd actually gone a little earlier to get started. And because with the second oxygen tank gone, I knew the mothership would be shut down completely. As it couldn't, the fuel cells wouldn't operate without oxygen and hydrogen. And I knew we couldn't use up the small batteries that were for entry. They weren't very big batteries, 3 of them, small 48 amp hour batteries. So I knew the command module would just be shut down. So I went to get started, and Jim joined me to get the LEM lunar module powered up to sort of live off of and buy time while more things got figured out.
And at that point, did you think that, okay, this is going to be tricky, but we're going to be able to get back by using the lunar module as a lifeboat?
Oh, I had no idea. There were a lot of things to figure out. I had confidence, though, because I knew that the brain trust we had on the ground, and I knew obviously as we worked through all these simulations, I knew the brain trust we had immediately, and then I knew we had a bigger brain trust across the country. See, NASA doesn't build a spacecraft. The spacecraft were built by some of those 400,000 people, a number of them the engineers, at the contractors that really designed and developed, manufactured, and tested the vehicles, and with the sign-off, delivered them to NASA to go fly. So all of that was available, all those minds. And that's the way the system was worked through problems on previous missions, too. I'd seen in action. Mission Control didn't have a ready answer. They went to the MIR, the Mission Evaluation Room, next door in the next building to Mission Control. They had communications to all that brain trust I mentioned. So they could direct, in fact, they had some of the contractor major players right there with them to go back to the plants in California or New York or Ham Standard in Connecticut or you name it, and dig out what information they needed. So I knew that was all in work to figure out an alternate plan, if you will. I knew we had a chance of getting back, and certainly in the right direction, because we had the LEM and we had an engine. I knew the decent engine, so I knew at least we could get on the path to come home. I wasn't concerned about that. But now, how to live off this LEM, which is a 2-day vehicle for 4 days, had some question marks. So a lot of those kind of things I knew were being worked. So I know I didn't. We never ever got to a point where it was like you're falling off the edge of the cliff, so to speak. It's never a point where you say, well, it's all over. In any point in the whole mission.
So you always felt there was hope that it was going to work out in the end.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was interesting. Mission Control felt that too. When I went back over 20 years after I retired from Northrop Grumman, I had some time, and went back and dug out the inner room tapes in Mission Control for that time. The tapes that never leaves the room. It's within the system people in the room and their support rooms and their discussions as they were powering down the command module. Realize that there was no procedure to power down the command module, just as there was no procedure to power back up. Those had to be invented. And they were ad-libbing as they were going through. I could hear their sort of professional, technical arguments about how to power it down, because they were worried about damaging something in the system and doing so that they wouldn't be able to power it back up. So in their minds, they already had us back. We were going to enter, and they wanted their mothership to be able to be powered back up. So it's interesting to hear that years later. That was their feelings too. They said, we're going to get this thing. We'll figure out how to power it back up and get through the entry whenever they get back there. So that's the way that part of the expert world was thinking at that time.
I mean, amazing can-do attitude, I guess. It must have been quite crowded in the LEM then with the three of you if it was designed for two, because it wasn't that roomy for two people, was it?
Well, there was a hole in the back, in the aft section of the LEM. There was a kind of a cylindrical projection up into the cabin, and that was the upper end of the Ascent rocket engine, the one that would lift you off the moon. And it made a natural perch for Jack Schweigert to sit on. So Jack was right in the back behind us. Jim and I would be up in the front positions, standing, and Jack would be perched in the middle, back behind us there. So, it wasn't really jammed up in that sense, because that area would normally be vacant anyway. It's overall, you'd have to say the square footage available was less than the command module. Obviously, it had that whole lower equipment bay where it was the food service, and the potty was down there, that kind of thing. So you had that added area down below the feet in the couch areas, and the command module, you didn't have that much open area in the LEM.
How much could your family hear as to what was going on at home? Because they had these boxes in the houses, didn't they? So they could listen to some of the communication.
They could listen to all the air-to-ground. In other words, they could hear what the Capcom called up or passed up to us, and vice versa, what we repeated back to the Capcom mission control. They could not hear all these other loops I mentioned I went back into later. The inner loops, I'll call it. During the mission, there might be 5 or 6 loops of discussion going on, all the various controllers and various disciplines. But no, they heard that, and I think all of that though still had to the general public, and I'm not sure if they were that guy too, say the reporters and whatever. It may have been it was a 2 or 5 second delay. I think NASA had a built-in delay before that transmission actually was heard. I don't know if that applied to the home or not.
I can't imagine, sort of listening to that and knowing the sort of crisis that you're facing up there.
Well, actually, it should have been. It was funny. It was funny. Some of the human aspects put into the movie of my extreme throw up, but Jim Lovell hugging me, Jack Schweiger and I's argument, that kind of stuff that didn't happen. I kind of complained to Ron Howard after the first showing about that, and his answer was, NASA gave me all the air to ground that had been spoken by the Capcom and yourselves during the mission, and he said it never seemed to me you ever had a problem. So he said, I had to figure out some way to make you seem more humanize you. So he said, that's why I put some of that added drama in the movie. So I'm hoping our families felt the same way. And of course, they had a lot of support. At each home, there were other astronauts. There were other astronaut wives. They brought food, all that kind of stuff. So they had actually one NASA protocol officer. That the movie at the end did injustice to that person. The NASA protocol officer did whatever the wife wanted done. If they wanted him to go get groceries, if they wanted him to answer the phone, I mean, that was his role. His role was complete support of the wife and the family. And the movie kind of led you to lead that was a little different. That he was trying to force, I think, Marilyn Lovell to go talk to reporters or something. But the family had a lot of support, from other astronauts that could explain what was going on and that kind of thing.
And I guess, as you said, you were used to working through problems through the simulations that you'd been doing. So it wasn't as though you were going to get into a state of panic about this. You were just going to work it through with all the brains that, as you say, you had on the ground.
No, there's no question that the program like Apollo also attracted many of the very brightest, dedicated kind of people. I mean, the challenge drew people, engineers, management type people. The program had the best of the best around the country because of that, just that intriguing mission, drew that attention.
Did you ever talk about if you weren't going to be able to make it back, and what you might have planned to have? I don't know whether NASA had planned that you would be able to speak to your families or what.
No, I never thought about that facet of it. Of course, if I had thought about it, I would hope it wouldn't stop things, just as I hoped, and we hoped Apollo 1 fire wouldn't cancel the program. I mean, you have a goal, you want to achieve the goal, whatever it takes.
One of the, well, there's many scenes in the movie, but the movie about where the maneuvers to get you on the right trajectory back to Earth. I mean, they only really, I think, feature one in the movie, but you were doing like 2 or 3 of those, I think. Is that correct?
We did 4 of them. We did the first one, which was a very critical one, that did get us on the path on call it a pseudo free return. That's the one that put us around the moon at about 130 miles. And if nothing else was done, we would have splashed down near Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. But at least we're on our way back to Earth. And the second maneuver was done after we passed the backside of the moon at the lowest point, by 2 hours past that point. It was the longest maneuver we did. And those 2 maneuvers, incidentally, were done fully on the LIM computer, all automated. Jim controlled the stop and start of the engine, and he worked the throttle on the decent engine. But basically, the attitude control was done through the computer on those 2 maneuvers. And what that second burn did was several things that put us, it cut 10 hours off our return, which gave us margins on our consumables, water and electric power primarily, and as it turned out, then the lithium cartridge, carbon dioxide cure. And it put us back by our primary recovery force with the Iwo Jima aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And thirdly, to satisfy the AEC, it put the LIM likely breakup in the pieces coming in a deep part of the Pacific Ocean, because that RTG with the nuclear core was still on board the LIM. The thing that would have been the power source for the experiment we would have left on the moon had we landed. So the AEC was hoping it would end up in a deep part of the ocean. And so that burn did all of those 3 things for us. We did 2 more mid-courses. They were very small burns, all manual, just looking out the window. Not looking out the window, but looking at an instrument that gave us yellow bars to hold steady. Very short maneuvers. One was 18-something seconds. The other one was like 21 and a little over seconds. So and that was exaggerated in the movie. It had the Earth going up and down like we're about to go out of control. We didn't deviate more than a degree during those short burns. So, but that was just kind of fine-tuning the final trajectory to make sure we're in the sort of the center of the entry corridor coming back in.
You mentioned, going around the moon. What was it like being so close, but passing over your landing area and seeing all the things that you've been training for?
Well, it's a brief looking down the Tromaro area, and Jim, of course, I think was more down than I was because this was his second time back to the moon, and he had seen all this before through several revolutions on Apollo 8, and now losing the landing. Jack and I were busy shooting pictures. We got our cameras and we shot a lot of pictures. At 130 miles, we got to see a bigger expanse of that part of the moon than had been seen on any of the missions, which orbited at roughly at the 60 miles altitude. So we were double the altitude. And I was impressed about just how much more rugged the backside looked. You know, it apparently over the billions of years had not gotten quite as big impacts as the front side had, the side we look at all the time, that gave you those big dark areas. Those were huge meteorites apparently that hit to cause that melting of the rock in those big smooth looking areas, which if you get down to the fine look at them, I don't think they're probably smooth anywhere. They got small craters because the moon's continually getting bombarded every day by something. And but backside didn't have many of those kind of features. We had Tsiolkovsky. I shot a good picture of, which is a beautiful crater, dark with a mountain in the center. And the other one, which wasn't as beautiful looking, that wasn't as dark an area, was Sea of Moscow. Those were the two more prominent features on the backside I spotted that I did get pictures of. They had Russian names because the Russians, of course, went around the moon the first time and shot pictures, so that gave them naming rights.
They were the first ones to get a lander on there, weren't they?
Also, yes, right.
Obviously, you're having to keep the power usage really low. So what are you eating during this period? I mean, you can't heat anything, I'm presuming, food-wise.
No, when we lost the command module, we lost all hot food or hot water. So the LEM had none of that. Now, Jim and Jack tried to eat some of what they call wet packs, which was like Frankfurters in a pack. I think I saw one picture of Jack's with a spooning out of one of these I assume it was like a thick beef stew, but it was probably at like 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So I elected to live off of the second area in the pantry, which had snacks. So for 4 days, I ate peanuts, bread cubes, and cookie cubes. So that was my meals for 4 days. I didn't even bother with that other. And of course, the freeze dry, which was the bulk of the menus, was that dry powdered stuff. And that even when you had the hot water in the command module and very carefully tried to mix it all in the bag, well, before you tried to eat it, it was a little cold then, cool, I should say, not cold. So I normally tape the bag to a floodlight with gray tape to heat it up a little more before I tried to eat it. So I wasn't too enamored with that powdered food anyway.
You see, you're getting all the top astronaut tips on Cold War conversations.
But, food was not a problem. The water is always, for a human, is a critical element. And we had abundant drinking water. We never had a problem with that. Right now I got a little fat around my girth that I could probably handle 20 days without eating. And still survive.
You and me both.
Yeah. So, but water, you need water. In 3 days, you'd be probably a goner without water.
In the film, it shows it getting cold. How cold was it in there?
Well, I can't tell you exactly in the lunar module because we did not have a temperature gauge. An indication, though, was the water tanks in the command module froze. The water tanks froze, and they were found still frozen when it was recovered on board the carrier hangar deck. When they retrieved the carrier after the splashdown, they went in and examined the vehicle, and they found the water tank still frozen.
Wow. So
it was obviously below 0 Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit at some point in the mission. In the LEM, with our bodies' warmth and with a few of the pumps we had running and some of the electronics we had on, I'd assume we were probably in the mid to, say, 35 to 37 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere around in there. So we were not at freezing yet in the LEM lunar module.
And did you have any layers that you could put on to try and make you warmer?
Yeah. We had extra underwear, and we put on. I had 3 sets of underwear on under my outer garment. Unfortunately, they were short sleeve. They weren't long sleeve underwear. I wish I'd had thermal underwear, but there were three sets of cotton underwear, and I had all that on.
Yeah.
People often ask, why didn't we put on our spacesuits with the lithium cartridge tying up one of the hose sets in the limb for that purpose of cleansing carbon dioxide. There was only one set of free hoses on the commander's side. And in that spacesuit, if you didn't have those cooling hoses hooked up, you would have perspired in the suit, even in that temperature. So Jim Lovell decided that rather than one of us maybe be reasonably comfortable in a spacesuit, we'd all suffer equally. So none of us got in our spacesuits.
Now, you briefly mentioned there the carbon dioxide filters. Now, one of the memorable sequences is where the crew are trying to make the converter so they can fit the round peg, fit the square hole using bits of flight plan, cardboard, duct tape. Were you involved in that?
No, I was not. I was actually for the first few days. Well, the way we shifted was I was always on alone, and Jim and Jack then would be on. It's hard to appreciate, but see, Jack, until in flight, when he showed up in the lunar module, after powering down the command module, he had never been in a lunar module in his life.
Wow.
On the ground or anywhere. So he was, not very knowledgeable, obviously, about that spacecraft. So Jim decided we should shift that way, and Jack would be on with him, and then I'd be off. So I'd be off duty. So it was on my off-duty time that they got the instructions to put together that cartridge thing, which incidentally, like most things, was thoroughly checked out on the ground. They actually had a chamber, a vacuum chamber in Building 7 at Johnson Space Center that had a lunar module environmental system in it for testing that system. And what they set up was a test where they impregnated that chamber with a very extreme dose of carbon dioxide with that rig they rigged on the ground to make sure it would cleanse, that it would work. So that was kind of testing done on the ground before that procedure was ever passed up. And almost all the procedures were done that way. In simulators, astronauts would check out the procedure they invented and redline it if something was wrong in it, and it'd go back to be reworked. And so all those things were refined that way. The simulators were run 24 hours a day during that time period. And some astronauts were available to go in and check out anything that needed to get checked out. So that was, again, the kind of support in the system that was going on the ground during that time.
When the carbon dioxide problem reared its head, were you worried at all at that point?
Oh, no. I just figured out, the loose ends of what had to get figured out was being worked. And so I was really just awaiting the next procedure and refinement and procedure. The biggest one that we worried about the timeliness of it was the activation of the mothership, the command module. As I told you, there was no procedure because the command module was never supposed to be shut down in flight. So none of our books had any procedure on how to power it up. And Jack copied that. That was a very lengthy procedure with no blank paper. So he had to rip the backs off of a number of checklists that were blank to use to copy that procedure down very meticulously, number the pages so it'd have the flow straight. And we got that procedure passed up to 17 hours before entry, before we're going to hit the air. The first time we got to see that procedure of activating the capsule was 17 hours before entry. Jack and I did that power up. Jim stayed in the limb to control attitude, have communication, etc. If we had problems to talk about. And Jack and I went into that dead command module probably at 3 hours before entry because they weren't going to allow us to start the power up till 2.5 hours before we hit the air, going 25,000 miles an hour. So we went in there about 3 hours ahead, and it's dark, no lights, completely dead. Looked with flashlights, looked around the instrument panel. First thing, Jack got out 2 towels so we could wipe off the instruments that were covered with water. And the first step in that procedure was for on each side of the spacecraft, Jack and I were to push in circuit breakers that had all been pulled out when Jack had shut it down. And Jack looked, thinking about all that water, said, let me call out a countdown, and let's go down the rows of circuit breakers and only push in 6 at a time and stop. And then we'll sit for a minute or so and see if we smell insulation burning from a electric short.
Yeah.
So that's the way we went through the circuit breaker, getting them all in. And we fortunately never ran into an electric short, which was beneficial from the Apollo 1 fire that killed the crew, because they had a very stringent set of wiring criteria and hermetically sealing connectors as part of that accident board's review that was imposed on all the spacecraft subsequently. So it basically made our wiring system waterproof. So anyway, we got through that. Jack activated the fully activated machine, got a star alignment, and miraculously it had come to life. Jack was in the position to do the entry on the left couch, but did an automatic entry using the computer that had been powered up. And from the Apollo overall program report, I looked in one of the appendices, which covered entry performance, and we tied for the second most accurate splashdown of the program.
Brilliant.
So, it was because we had obviously violated certainly the specifications that had been laid on the electronics in that vehicle, in the command module, freezing it for 4 days. So we had violated specifications, but yet that thing came back to life and gave us a second most accurate splashdown of the program.
When you were not working through a problem, were there quite long periods of downtime where there was nothing for you to do?
Yes, there was. Long gaps. I talk a little bit with I would, when I was on that way alone, I'd talk with Capcom occasionally, with Jack. Jack allows most of them were in my group that I knew well, and enjoyed the view. It was amazing because we never really were steady. We kind of rolled around slowly. So I'd get alternate views of Earth and Moon as we continually sort of revolved around. Not in the classic PTC or whatever it's called that would vary the sunlight around the vehicle evenly. We never could set that up very well with just the lunar module, even when we had the computer up. So it was kind of a random cycling, but very slow. And so you had these alternate views to look at, and I got cat naps. I call not deep sleep, but cat naps here and there, because sleep was sporadic. We never had a regular work day, sleep night kind of thing with the way that mission went. Because the times when they figured something out and when the next thing happened didn't necessarily fit a day-night timeline. So you kind of got cat naps where you could.
Before you go into re-entry, I mean, that re-entry is always a potentially dangerous time. Did you say a few words to each other before going into re-entry, or was it just, here we go?
No. Yeah, there was a lot of things crowded into that period. See, we had First of all, separate the service module. I can't remember how far away from entry that was. And that's the first time we got to look at the damage. And then very late, we separated the limb because we were using the limb for communication and attitude control, as I said, all the time till we got the. So we were still using the limb at 2.5 hours before entry. Jim was in the limb while we were powering up the command module. So probably until Jack got the command module fully powered up and the star alignment done, where the command module could do the dual attitude control, we were probably within less than 2 hours, probably an hour and a half from hitting the air when we jettisoned the limb. And we did that by over-pressurizing the area in between, in the tunnel area between the two vehicles. And Jack deliberately pointed us off to one side when we basically fired the pyrotechnics that cut the tunnel to give the limb a little kick. So we kicked it out sideways to make sure it didn't run into us on entry. That was shortly coming up. So that was done very late to get rid of the limb.
Were you concerned that there might have been heat shield damage or damage to the parachutes?
I didn't think the parachutes would be a problem, but the heat shield, but it's one of these things. Well, so what? What are you going to do? Not enter? So that was one of these things you just say, well, let's hope it's not damaged too bad. And you got to go through the entry. So
with splashdown, how fast are you coming down? How fast do you hit the water?
Quite soft compared to what we thought it might be because of Apollo 12. It must have been the wind state and the way they hit a wave or something. But they had a very hard splashdown on 12. In fact, it broke a camera bracket holding a camera over Al Bean's head and actually hit his head. And he got a little slight laceration, a wound, when it fell down by his head and down into the floorboards at the bottom from their impact. And I was sort of half expecting that may be the case. But I felt that, I wouldn't say it was soft, but it was a lot smoother than I expected.
What was it like breathing that air in? When the hatch was open and you smell the sea air, what is that moment like?
Well, the moment was really the moment of when you got it made. If you were talking about that, most was when you see 3 chutes or 2 chutes. You need 2 of 3, and you're looking up out the window at see those big chutes reef and then open up wide. That's the time you really got it made. It's kind of like that single engine out of lunar orbit. It's the same thing. And until that engine fires to get you out of lunar orbit, you don't know you're coming home. And the second thing is they're not going to know you're coming home safely until those 3 chutes are out. And so that's when yep, but we've made it. So the splashdown itself was kind of ancillary event to that. But it was nice to have the hatch open. We were still cold inside. Smoky air poured out of the capsule when that hatch opened into that moist, warm air in the South Pacific. So it was nice to get out and smell real air too. The capsules have a particular odor when 3 humans live in that confined space for a number of days we did. And so it was nice to smell nice fresh air.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you weren't well in the last part of the mission. So how are you feeling at this point? I think you had a kidney infection.
It was actually a urinary tract in the lower area. And it was a Pseudomonas type bug, which was, we had terramycin, I think it was on board. I took some of that before entry. But that's just kind of a general antibiotic. So they had to actually figure out with a sample they took what the specific bug was. And then it was a directed set of 2 shots a day I got for almost 2 weeks to take care of that bug I had. But I had chills and fever. It's kind of like, I describe it for people. It's kind of like flu, having a case of flu, chills and fever alternating, and burning when you urinate as a byproduct of UTI. But nothing. Again, the movie kind of over dramatized it, like I was on the deathbed. It wasn't. It wasn't quite that bad. I mean, I could function and do things that, if you have a urinary tract infection, it wouldn't stop you from going to the grocery store, or if you had one here on Earth. I mean, you could do all your normal activity. You wouldn't feel like going to the gym and working out, but other than that. So no, I was not incapacitated by any means by it. It just felt lousy.
And when did you get the first chance to speak to your family?
That was at Hawaii. We splashed down, as I said, the Iwo Jima carrier was there to pick us up. They flew us on a helicopter the next morning to Hawaii, and not to Hawaii, to Samoan Islands. And it was a brief ceremonial thing went on there. Then we were taken on board an Air Force C-141 transport. And that transport aircraft flew us to Hawaii, where President Nixon, with Air Force One, had picked up our wives. Not Jack wasn't married, so not his wife, but Jim's wife Marilyn and my wife Mary were picked up actually at Houston, because Nixon went through there to give a medal to the Mission Control people, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He gave to Mission Control people, and then they boarded again with our wives and were brought to Hawaii to meet us there.
That must have been quite an emotional meeting, yeah?
It was, yeah. That was a spectacular occasion to be back in civilization and have that kind of honor and tribute from the president, and of course see our wives for the first time in, well, really about 8 days, I guess. Well, probably 10 days from the time we got to the Cape and get ready to launch. So we're probably gone 10 days or so from home at that point.
How soon were they doing debriefings with you? Were they already doing that on Iwo Jima or not?
We started them, though, as soon as we got back to Houston. And there's actually kind of a checklist format that's been set up from previous flights that Deke joined you, Deke Slayton, and you just sort of go step by step from the very even before the mission, before flying, about all the preparations, to pick out any things that might need to be improved. It's mainly looking at it from that aspect. And just kind of went through that whole flight that way. And that was several days of that. Then we met with the engineers, subsystem managers, and the people, and almost went through system by system how things had acted, what was unusual, what malfunctions we had to deal with. So we kind of a full debrief of the spacecraft's how it had worked and its health through the mission. So we did a pretty extensive set of briefings for I don't know, probably a week and a half back at Houston though.
Now, we've touched on the film because that's most people's reference point for the Apollo 13 mission. But I mean, I think we've already covered some of the inaccuracies, but was it reasonably accurate, would you say, in its portrayal of the mission?
Yeah, I think some things. Well, if you just talk it from the media look standpoint, they rented time on a zero-G airplane, and they took the actors up and actually had some of the scenes shot with them floating in a short period in zero-G. They built very accurate mock-ups that were used in the films of the spacecraft, of the cockpits, and the geometry of everything with the tunnel and whatever. All of that was very accurate done. They did a good job, I thought, with the visual aspects, even out the window, somewhat exaggerated motion. Again, it was another thing in the motion of the vehicles, but they obviously carried very well the overall theme of Apollo 13, which was the sense of people in trouble, which we were, in a team that worked diligently to work through various problems, some of which they portrayed well. They kind of hand chose the difficult things that would show well on media to pick, and did a good job of that to show again the teamwork that went on to solve those issues and help get us back. But no, most of the graphics type stuff as Hollywood does well, and not just on this movie, but most movies have got all this computer-aided graphics. It's pretty amazing these days. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like Ron Howard, the director, was almost disappointed by how efficiently you dealt with the problems, and there wasn't enough drama there.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was in the voices. He expected some degree of, I guess, concern or frightenedness or whatever to come across in the voices of, that we aren't going to get back or whatever. None of that, obviously. We just were one by one tackling the things and copying procedures up, and then debriefing after we executed a maneuver of how things went. That kind of pretty routine.
Just a routine mission, hey, Fred?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it was. I mean, and as far as the root aspects of what you do, same way in testing the vehicle in the plant. We dealt with an incredible number of problems with the early limbs. A lot of it was the procedures we wrote were incorrect, but there's no end of dealing with things not quite right for that whole year. Yeah, I spent days on tests where it'd be 23 hours straight, or 27 hours straight on one of the radar tests I did. I'd take a nap on the floor if they had a halt to some anomaly show up. We couldn't figure out why. You'd always call a halt, just like a crime scene. When you run into that in a spacecraft test, you stop, and now you do a lot of talking and surveying of what possibly went wrong, and then you have to carefully develop a retest that's not going to mess up the crime scene, that you never figure out what went wrong. That's a kind of the ritual that goes on in spacecraft testing. Same in aircraft testing. In fact, if you're building a new aircraft, it'd be the same thing.
And one of the scenes that's probably one of the most dramatic in the film is the delay in you re-establishing radio contact after re-entry. Was that correct, or was that just added for extra drama?
No, that was correct. It wasn't any trauma to us, because I didn't even have any idea what time we were going to come out of blackout, frankly. Now it was really a heartache and a concern, big concern for people on the ground, because they knew from the plots of the trajectory and whatever, really to the second almost, where we should have been in contact, radio contact. And when we didn't, when able to contact us, many people just had a real sinking spell about we had burned up an entry, that the heat shield had failed or something. So no, I had no idea of that, frankly, till afterwards, that trauma had gone on.
Very powerful scene. Fred, your book is called Never Panic Early, an Apollo 13 astronaut's journey. I love the title, and you've sort of summed that up in our conversation.
If you read the book, you'll find it's mentioned again in several places in separate ways, but it's something all of us face in everyday life. If you have an injury in a child, I don't know if you're married and have children, but if you have all at once something happens to your child, there's a period there where you'll do better if you just don't do anything for a few moments, and to figure out what's really the situation, and then figure out the best course of action. That was expressed in the movie when Gene Kranz in the movie told the mission controllers to stop, get settled, and figure out things. Don't do anything wrong that can make things worse. Gene Kranz had that kind of a statement in the movie, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's best to survey the situation and then figure out the best course of action, and now obviously promptly take that action.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite lines from the film is when the Krantz says, let's figure out what is working here.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's the point I was talking about. And they was telling them, don't do anything that'll make things worse.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos, and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. If you'd like to help the project, just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.